The bus was packed, as it always was during the evening rush hour. People crammed together, each of them trying to make their way home after a long day at work. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, and the hum of chatter, the usual noise of tired commuters. Some were glued to their phones, others stared blankly out of the windows, and a few exchanged the occasional tired glance. It was a scene repeated every weekday, but today something seemed different. In the midst of this, an older man stood, holding on to the bus pole with a quiet strength. His clothes were simple, nothing flashy, just a plain shirt and pants, worn from years of use. His face, though calm, showed the marks of a life that hadn't always been easy. The lines around his eyes and mouth told stories of pain, memories that he often tried to push away, yet they lingered in the quiet moments of his thoughts. He was a war veteran, a man who had seen things many would never understand, but today, he stood there, steady and composed, as the bus bounced along its route. The door creaked open at the next stop, and a young woman stepped on. She was visibly pregnant, her round belly heavy with the life inside her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as she entered, scanning the bus for a place to stand. She looked exhausted, her eyes tired but determined. The crowded bus offered little room, and the seats were mostly taken. She took a deep breath and moved further down the aisle, hoping to find a small space to hold on to. The soft swaying of the bus seemed to make everything harder, her body already aching from the strain. The bus jerked forward, and the pregnant woman gripped the metal pole tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her legs were aching from standing for what felt like too long, and the constant sway of the vehicle only made it worse. Each stop, each sudden lurch of the bus, sent waves of discomfort through her. She shifted her weight, trying to find a more stable position, but the crowd around her made it difficult. Her hands trembled slightly, and the warmth of the bus seemed to press in on her, adding to the fatigue that had already set into her bones. She glanced around, hoping to find a seat, but the bus was packed. A few people glanced up from their phones, but most were too absorbed in their own world to notice her. The tiredness in her eyes grew heavier, and a deep sigh escaped her lips. She knew it wasn't long before the pressure in her lower back would become unbearable. The thought of standing all the way home made her stomach turn. The veteran across the aisle noticed her struggle. His eyes softened as he watched her, the way she swayed with the bus's movements, trying her best to stay upright. He saw the discomfort in her posture, the small winces as she shifted her weight, and the way she looked around, searching for something she couldn't find. For a moment he simply observed, the noise of the bus fading away as he focused on her. He felt a tug at his chest, a quiet empathy that stirred deep within him. The woman's discomfort reminded him of his own struggles, the pain that had lingered in his body long after his time in service. His back wasn't what it used to be, and the years of hard living and heavy lifting had left their mark. He'd learned to ignore the aching joints and tired muscles, just as he'd learned to ignore the memories that haunted him. But he couldn't ignore her. The way she held herself, the subtle grimaces that passed over her face, it was too much like something he knew all too well. He tightened his grip on the bus pole, the metal biting into his palm, and shifted his weight, feeling the familiar aches in his knees. His body screamed at him to stay seated, to let someone else deal with the woman's struggle. But something inside him, something that had always been there, a kind of instinct he could never shake, pushed him to act. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He simply stood, the creak of his joints echoed in his ears as he slowly rose to his feet. He didn't rush, but he moved with purpose, his body groaning with each step. The bus lurched again, and he almost stumbled, but he steadied himself, focusing on the pregnant woman ahead of him. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on her own discomfort. When he reached her, he cleared his throat gently, making sure not to startle her. She turned, surprised to see him standing beside her, his gaze steady but kind. Without a second thought, the veteran spoke softly, but with quiet authority. "Please, ma'am," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "take my seat." He motioned toward the empty spot next to him. It wasn't much, just a small worn-out seat, but it was hers if she needed it. He didn't wait for her to respond. His body may have been tired, but his heart knew the weight of kindness, and the need to help someone who might be struggling. He didn't see her as just another tired commuter. He saw her as someone who needed a hand, someone who deserved respect. The woman blinked, caught off guard by the sudden offer. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone offer their seat. She hesitated for a moment, the surprise flashing across her face, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw something deeper than just an offer of a seat. There was kindness there, and something else, something unspoken that touched her heart. After a pause, she nodded slowly, gratitude filling her chest. She moved toward the seat, and as she lowered herself down, a soft sigh of relief escaped her lips. It felt like a small victory, in the midst of a long, tiring day. The woman's heart skipped a beat, as she looked up, still surprised by the offer. She had gotten used to people ignoring her, or worse, pretending not to see her. People were too absorbed in their own lives, too preoccupied with their phones or their tiredness, to notice someone who clearly needed help. But this man, the veteran, was different. There was something in his eyes, something that made her pause. His gaze was steady, not one of pity, but of genuine kindness, as if he saw her not just as a pregnant woman, but as a person worthy of respect. She had never seen such a simple act of kindness from a stranger. It was enough to make her stomach tighten with emotion. For a moment she couldn't find the words to express what she was feeling. She was so used to dealing with life on her own, without expecting anything from anyone. But here he was, offering his seat without a second thought. With a soft, grateful smile, she nodded, finally taking the seat. She sank into it, the relief almost immediate. Her feet, aching from standing, felt as though they could finally rest, and she let out a quiet, contented sigh. She glanced up at the veteran, unsure of what to say. There was so much she wanted to thank him for, but the words felt inadequate. She simply smiled again, her heart full. But then, as she sat, she noticed something. A flash of pain crossed the veteran's face. At first, she thought it was just a fleeting expression, but as she looked closer, she saw the tightness in his posture. His hand gripped the bus pole harder, his knuckles white. He wasn't standing easily. He was struggling. Her gaze lingered on him, and that's when it hit her. He wasn't just offering his seat out of courtesy, he was enduring his own pain to help her. It wasn't obvious at first, but now that she was seated and could see him more clearly, she realized just how much he was pushing himself. His body was unsteady, as though every muscle in him was begging for rest. His face was taut, and she saw the way his posture swayed ever so slightly. He wasn't just an elderly man being kind, he was fighting his own discomfort, his own silent suffering, to help her. Her heart ached for him, a deep, unfamiliar ache. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words didn't come. All she could do was watch, as he gripped the pole even tighter. He wasn't asking for help, not once, but it was clear now that he needed it. Then, as the bus made another sharp turn, the veteran stumbled, his legs buckled, and for a moment it seemed like he might fall. The pregnant woman's reflexes kicked in, and before she even realized it, she had reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm to steady him. His weight leaned into her for a split second, and she could feel the tremor in his body. The moment felt like it stretched out, suspended in time. Their eyes met. It wasn't a fleeting glance, but a long, silent connection. In his eyes she saw exhaustion and pain, but also something else, something that made her chest tighten. In that fleeting moment, it felt as if both of them understood each other completely, despite the vast differences in their lives. The veteran, who had carried so much burden for so long, and she carrying the weight of a child, and the grief of losing her partner, both silently acknowledging the struggle of their own journeys. She smiled at him, soft and sincere, the kind of smile that spoke volumes. It was a smile of gratitude, but also one of deep concern. She wasn't just thankful for his gesture, she was also worried about him, and in that brief exchange he smiled back, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that softened his weathered face. He nodded slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm all right, ma'am, thank you for your kindness," but she could see it. He was not all right, he was far from it. She wanted to say something more, to ask him if he needed help, but the moment was fleeting, swallowed up by the noise of the bus and the pressing crowd. Still, she couldn't help but feel that the brief, silent connection they shared in that moment was more meaningful than anything else that could have been said. The veteran gently patted the woman's hand, his weathered fingers brushing against her skin in a reassuring gesture. He gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his tired eyes. I'm all right, ma'am, thank you, he murmured, his voice steady but faint. His words were meant to comfort her, but the woman couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. She watched him closely, her gaze lingering on the faded scars that marred the back of his hands. His skin was rough, worn from years of hard work, and the scars told stories that words never could. She wondered how many of those marks had been earned in battle, how many had been left behind after his time in service. His hands were strong but trembled ever so slightly, as if each movement sent a ripple through him. But it wasn't just his hands that caught her attention. It was the look in his eyes, the distant haunted expression that flickered there whenever he wasn't focused on something immediate. For a moment, his gaze had drifted to the window, his face hardening as if he was lost in a memory he couldn't escape. She had seen that look before. It was a look of someone who had seen things that had broken them, things that no one should ever have to experience. In that moment, she realized that his act of kindness wasn't just a simple gesture of courtesy, it wasn't just the politeness of an old man offering his seat to a tired woman. There was something deeper at play, something tied to his past, to the things he had endured that made him see the world in a different light. His kindness, his quiet strength, it all spoke of a life lived through hardship, a life that had shaped him into the person he was today. The woman's heart softened. She thought back to the stories she had heard, stories about veterans who came back from war forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed. Stories about the weight they carried in their souls, stories of men and women who found it impossible to forget what they had seen. It was a burden that no one could truly understand unless they had lived through it. Was this man one of those people? Did he carry memories of a past that he had never spoken of? Memories that had scarred him in ways she couldn't imagine. The thought made her stomach twist with empathy. She could feel a connection to him in that moment, something unspoken that tied them together in their shared suffering. She wanted to ask him about his past, to know what had made him the person he was, but she didn't. There was something sacred in his silence, and she respected that. Her concern for him deepened as she continued to watch him. His body language had shifted slightly. He was no longer standing as straight as he had been. His shoulders hunched ever so slightly, and his breathing seemed shallow, labored. She could see him trying to keep it together, trying not to let the pain show, but it was becoming harder and harder for him to mask it. His hands gripped the bus pole with a tightness that suggested he was fighting against something that was slowly taking its toll. Suddenly, as the bus came to a screeching halt at the next stop, the veteran stumbled again. His body lurched forward, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as if he might collapse. Without thinking, the woman stood up instantly. Her instincts kicked in, and she moved toward him, her hand outstretched to steady him. She could feel the tension in his arm as he fought to regain his balance, but she wasn't going to let him fall. "Sir, you need to sit down," she said urgently, her voice filled with concern. "You're not all right, you need to rest." The veteran hesitated for a moment, his pride making him reluctant to accept her help, but she could see it in his eyes. He knew he couldn't keep standing much longer, his body was betraying him, and he was too tired to keep fighting it. "You need this seat more than I do," she insisted, her voice soft but firm. "Please, sit down, let me help you." For a moment he seemed to be wrestling with the decision, but eventually with a sigh he nodded. She gently guided him to the seat she had vacated earlier, making sure he was settled before sitting beside him. As the bus rumbled forward, the veteran's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax. He didn't speak much, but the gratitude in his eyes was enough. In that quiet moment, they both shared a silent understanding. He had fought battles in his past, but here, now, on this crowded bus, they were both fighting a different kind of battle, one of survival, of kindness, and of the deep, unspoken connections that could arise in the most unexpected of places. As the bus hummed along, the veteran settled into the seat, his tired body finally allowing him a moment of rest. His shoulders slumped in a way that revealed just how much he had been holding in. The woman sat beside him, her eyes still filled with concern, but now, there was a sense of quiet understanding between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the bus seemed distant, as if the noise and bustle of the city had faded into nothingness. It was the veteran who broke the silence. His voice was low and rough, the words coming out slowly, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. I was injured during my service, he said, his eyes focusing on the floor, avoiding her gaze. It was years ago, but the pain, it never really goes away. I've gotten used to it. Learned to live with it, you know. But it gets harder sometimes. The woman's heart sank as she listened to him. There was a rawness in his words, an honesty she hadn't expected. She could hear the weight of years in his voice, the unspoken burden of someone who had given so much and in return, had received only the quiet suffering of a body that had endured too much. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, but all she could do was listen. I don't talk about it much, he continued, his hand gripping the pole again, though it was shaking now. People don't want to hear about it. I didn't want to burden anyone with my pain, so I just keep going. Helping others, offering whatever I can, it's the only way I know how to cope. The woman's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. You've been through so much, she said, her voice trembling. And yet you still choose to help others. That says so much about who you are. She paused, her heart aching for him, and then she found herself sharing a piece of her own story. I lost my husband not long ago, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rumble of the bus. He was sick for a long time, and I watched him suffer. Now I'm carrying our child alone. She took a deep breath, the pain of her loss washing over her. It's not easy, but I try to keep going. For my baby. For him. The veteran turned to her, then his eyes soft with understanding. There was no judgment in them, just a shared sorrow that connected them in a way neither of them had expected. They both understood loss in a way that words couldn't describe, and in that moment, their shared pain became a bridge, drawing them closer. The bus neared her stop, and she stood, her hand lingering on the back of the veteran's seat for just a moment longer. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. For your kindness. For everything. She stepped toward the door, but before she exited, she turned back, offering him one last smile. It wasn't just a smile of gratitude, it was a smile of understanding, one that said more than words ever could. The veteran watched her leave, his chest tight with the emotions he had held inside for so long. As the bus doors closed, a single tear slid down his cheek. He hadn't expected to find a connection today, not with anyone. But in that brief encounter, with a stranger who had her own burdens to carry, he had found something he didn't realize he needed, a moment of shared humanity, and for that he was thankful. As the veteran sat back in his seat, the bus rolling steadily down the street, a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, the kind that couldn't be explained, only felt. He realized that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could heal the deepest wounds. For the pregnant woman, the encounter left an imprint on her heart. In a world full of strangers, she was reminded that there are still people willing to help, to make a difference. That moment would stay with her, a reminder of kindness found in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching this touching story of kindness and connection. Sometimes, the smallest acts can have the biggest impact, reminding us that even in the most difficult moments, we're not alone. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. Let's spread more kindness and compassion in the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, so you never miss a story that can inspire and uplift you. We appreciate you being part of our community.